Welcome, everyone. Thank you for zooming in. I'm the photo archivist, Kevin Johnson, at the Penobscot Marine Museum. And tonight, I'm going to be using fog as a gateway element to explore our collections. While I'll, of course, be showing photos that actually depict fog, I'll also be looking at some other events and stories that involve fog. So settle in for this foggy journey. So I'm going to start off with works by three photographers who were drawn to the aesthetic of fog. And then we'll jump into some of the other stories. The first one we're going to look at is Kosti Ruohomaa. So to Kosti, fog and other forms of inclement weather were a theme in his work. Fog imparted atmosphere, mood, and sometimes mystery or drama. Kosti's interest in fog is no secret. And in fact, on his photo agency's website, they have the following story. One story paints the picture of a raw Maine morning. A stranger wanders about at the edge of the sea. Two cameras slung over his shoulder. Seeing he is soaked to the bone, a local woman asks him in for coffee and questions what he was up to. His answer is simple. I'm looking at the fog. And with that, the stranger, Kosti, disappears back into the mist. Who knows if this is a true story, but I think you get the point. So we're going to look at about 10 photos of Kosti's, and while I'm sharing them with you, I'm going to read in his own words why he was drawn to fog. So here we're looking at a little scene of Port Clyde. So now in Kosti's words, one ordinarily associates fog as being an atmospheric condition detrimental to everyday living. It wreaks hardships on the automobile driver. It causes nightmares of anguish to ship captains who have to navigate through impenetrable fog. But fog is beautiful. It is a mood which cannot be duplicated by any other variation of the elements. It is somber, gray, and mournful. It is quiet and peaceful. To the farmer, it is almost a constant companion through his lonely chores during the fall season pre-dawn hours. It swallows him up with but the soft, diffuse light of his lantern to bring him identity. It is a boon through long months of slight rainfall as he depends on the fog's moisture to make things grow. Even the garish, bawdy lights of a great city are dulled by the fog. One can find solitude amid blaring horns and scurrying people when fog brings down its curtain of inherent quietness on the city. Fog, of course, is one of the good promoters of the state of Maine. Regretfully, it comes upon us. It cannot be ignored for the groans and moans of the foghorns. Thus, when one goes outdoors, one becomes quickly knowing of what it is meant by that old phrase. It's so darn thick out this morning, you can hardly spit. So with that little suite of images, we're going to move on to another photographer, Jeff Dworski, who was photographing in a different time period and using a different type of camera. Jeff moved to Stonington in 1973 at the age of 17 and began working as a sternman for a lobsterman. He eventually got his own boat and became a full-fledged lobsterman himself. Stonington is a foggy place. Beginning in 1989, he began a photographic project documenting a life that he saw rapidly disappearing. Here we see Paul Dorr and Carl Burgess halibut fishing in the fog on Paul's boat, the Brandy Lee. They're setting out their trawl line or hauling back, I can't tell. Jeff continued on his photo project for 4 years. Despite being from away, he had become accepted by a community that typically would not trust an outsider. But you can't make a photograph like this without trust. Here is Corey Holland in a dory inside of his herring weir off Stonington. While fog was often the subject of Kosti's photos, it was more of a backdrop for Jeff's. Here we see fishermen inside the green room at the Fisherman's Co-op. The men are choosing to hang out and drink coffee and smoke instead of going out on a frigid morning in the heavy sea smoke. Cigarettes forms its own fog inside. Jeff was from Cambridge, where his mother was a professor at Harvard. Stonington was everything his life in Cambridge wasn't. Rural, working class, and pretty gritty. Here we see Andrew Gove's wharf on a very cold morning. Jeff wanted to document a way of life that he feared was vanishing with the real estate boom of the 1980s, which brought wealthy outsiders to the island. I saw the Stonington I loved disappearing, he once told a magazine reporter. This is Colwell Brothers Wharf with the fish factory in the background, which are both now gone. And lastly, here is some magical fog in Stonington Harbor. Stonington is still a fishing town, but it has changed. All the men shown in the previous pictures are now past. Jeff ended his project in 1993, and his collection of 1,500 slides were donated to the museum. The third photographer we'll look at that has a love for the aesthetic of fog is Carroll Thayer Berry. Carroll Thayer Berry was an artist who lived in Rockport, which is pictured here. He was most known for his woodblock prints, but he was also an active photographer and an avid member of the Knox County Camera Club. He was a contemporary of Kosti, and like Kosti, he loved to photograph the fog. Here is his garden on a foggy day. His garden was one of his favorite subjects. He spent a lot of time on and around Maine's windjammer fleet. I could have put together an entire program of schooners in the fog, but I'm pretty sure I would have put you all to sleep. His favorite place to photograph was his backyard, Rockport Harbor. He was a founding member of Maine Coast Artists, which is now CMCA. Going on windjammer excursions often resulted in waiting out the fog. Isn't it amazing how a little fog and a ghostly schooner can transcend a photo of a woman wringing out a mop from ordinary to extraordinary? Berry took many photos of Andre the Seal's pen, which can be seen here out in the middle of Rockport Harbor with the looming fog in the distance. Apparently, though, he had little interest in photographing Andre himself, as no photos of the famous seal have turned up yet in his collection. Berry donated his photography collection to the museum himself in 1977. Our volunteer, Paul D'Orsay, has been cataloging his collection for several years now. So now we're going to take a little turn and head off into a different foggy direction. Our next stop is Camden. In May of 1977, Norman Rosemont produced a television movie of Rudyard Kipling's classic Captain Courageous, with the filming to take place in Camden. It had a budget of $1.5 million. Photojournalist Red Boutilier was on the scene to capture it all. The schooner Adventure was cast as the schooner We're Here. The Adventure, on the right, was an early Maine windjammer. Its schooner co-star was the schooner Roseway on the left. The Roseway was built in Essex, Massachusetts in 1925. She was made a National Historic Landmark in 1997 and is now the flagship of the World Ocean School. The Adventure is a knockabout fishing schooner, which were ships designed without bowsprits that fished the Grand Banks. She too was also built in Essex, Mass, a year after the Roseway. She also was declared a National Historic Landmark in 1994 and sails today in the tourist trade out of Gloucester. It must have been quite a scene in Camden during the filming, with TV stars wandering about. Here, Red captured Ricardo Montalban, giving an autograph to Matthew Greer, a Coast Guardman from ROCKLAND. Montalban, who was still early in his Fantasy Island career, played Manuel in the film. His co-star, Carl Malden, was also at the tail end of his TV hit series, The Streets of San Francisco, and he starred as Disco Troop. In this photo, we see him leaving Camden's famous Yorkie's restaurant. Red, playing paparazzi here, was using his old school speed Graflex, so it was not a subtle approach to take this photo. The captain on the schooner in the movie was not an actor, though many will say he is very much a character. Here he is, Captain Jim Sharp, who at the time owned the Adventure, and he owned it from 1965 to 1988. He currently presides over the Wind, Sail, and Steam Museum in ROCKLAND. The small bits and extras were filled by locals, most of which were fishermen or in other maritime trades. No doubt they were cast because they really looked the part. While not starring in the film, windjammers the Mercantile and Maddie and the Arctic explorers the schooner Bowden were all docked in Camden Harbor during the filming. You can see the Bowden on the far right, the Maddie in the middle, and the Mercantile on the left. Mount Batty in the background. And here we see the Adventure and the Roseway outside of Camden Harbor off Sherman Point, getting ready to film a scene. You're probably wondering at this point what this story has to do with fog. Well, the movie was probably made on the Maine coast to have access to schooners, but also have access to fog. Of course, fog is not something you can plan on. Or can you? When Mother Nature doesn't cooperate, there are other solutions. A couple of lobster boats, probably outfitted with thermal foggers, create an artificial fog bank. This technique, which is no longer used, aspirates a petroleum product like kerosene, which ignites in flame, heating a mixture of glycerol and air to create a dense fog. Thank you, Red, for capturing this artificially dramatic scene. Our next tale is that of the Alice E. Clark. The Alice E. Clark was an American four-masted schooner that weighed 1,621 tons. She was built in 1898 at the Percy and Small Boatyard in Bath, and she was built for the Winslow Company of Portland. Until 1909, she lived an unblemished career. On July 1st of 1909, she was on a route from Norfolk, Virginia to Bangor, loaded with 2,117 tons of coal. We will look at this wonderful Phillips Brothers map of Penobscot Bay to show her fatal route. She was coming up the east side of Penobscot Bay and was passing Islesboro on her left and Harborside on her right. Some of the official accounts state that she was in thick fog, and others say there was a low-lying haze. Just off Hutchins Island, she went on the wrong side of a spar buoy and struck Coombs Ledge. Had she been a half a boat length away in any direction, she would have cleared the ledge. She was thoroughly stuck. Her bow high up on the ledge and her stern in deep water and in a nearly upright position. The crew was able to escape easily. Notice the spar buoy. She remained on the ledge for more than 2 months. This led to opportunities for photographers to make photographs of the various salvage attempts. This is an Eastern Illustrating negative made into a postcard. There are several photographs showing the salvage efforts, and there is a fascinating summary of what happened after she became stuck. I'll read the summary while sharing the photos. Wrecking operations are to be resumed under the direction of Captain Jerry Hayes on the schooner Alice E. Clark, ashore on Coombs Ledge in the Eastern Bay. 2 unsuccessful efforts have been made to float the schooner, first by the Boston Towboat Company and then by Fields F. Pendleton of New York, both unsuccessful. In the second attempt to raise her, she slid partly off the ledge and now lies on her beam ends with her masts in the water. The Boston Towboat Company was to have $15,000 if they succeeded in floating the schooner, and nothing if they did not. And after expending $7,000, they abandoned the undertaking. Mr. Pendleton then bought the wreck for $600 and get out a considerable part of the cargo of 2,700 tons of soft coal. And then, with various wrecking appliances, the use of 4 schooners and 2 steamers, attempted to get the schooner off the ledge, but failed. There is said to be about 1,000 tons of coal left in the schooner, which it proposed to take out, and then another attempt may be made to float the vessel. If any man can do it, Captain Hayes can, said the Republican Journal in September of that year. He did not succeed, and her bones are still lying off Coombs Ledge today. A Republican Journal article attempted to set the record straight on the cause of the crash. It states, "The weather was clear, and the schooner was beating up the bay with a modest breeze. She struck about 6 p.m., nearly 2 hours after a fierce squall of that evening. The squall did not cause the accident, nor did the schooner miss stays as reported. And the statement in the daily papers that this rock is uncharted is equally unfounded. It is not only chartered, but buoyed, and the schooner lay inside of the black spar buoy, which is less than a half a length distance on the starboard bow. Half a length either way would have carried the schooner clear." This sure sounds like operator error to me, but the fog and the low-lying haze were probably useful for insurance purposes, and the captain's cried. Next up, we're going to look at the Tale of Two Cities, not the Dickens novel, but his tale of two of Penobscot Bay's pride and joy, the city of Bangor and the city of Rockland, both steamers on the Bangor to Boston run. The steamers City of Bangor and City of Rockland were sister ships that for decades carried people back and forth from Boston to Bangor. Through their storied careers, they had many fog-related experiences. We're going to take a look at 2 of these fog incidents, but first, let's learn a little bit about the vessels. First, we'll look at the city of Bangor. Here we see her making a stop at the Bayside Landing in Northport in this Charles Coombs photograph. This image will give you a sense of the sheer scale of this ship. In his book, Steamboat Lore of the Penobscot, John Richardson states, "The greatest thrill of all time for the steamboat world of the Penobscot came June 10th, 1894, when the SS City of Bangor made her first appearance in Penobscot waters. The Bangor was a true sensation, a leviathan compared to her predecessors, and a marvel of speed and luxury." Here we see a model of the city of Bangor that was built by Dick Brockway and gifted to the museum in 2004. Sadly, Dick just passed away somewhat recently. The city of Bangor was 277 feet long and had a deck higher than all of her predecessors. Despite her size, she could travel at 16 knots. Freight and passenger traffic increased by leaps and bounds and earned her the nickname of the floating gold mine. She was amazingly dependable. In 1895, she was scheduled for 145 trips and made them all. On September 28th of 1902, while under the command of Howard Averett, she struck the ledges on the southeastern side of Monhegan Island in dense fog. Under her own power, she attempted to get to Rockland, but it was found she was taking on water, so she made her way to Spruce Head Island and beached herself in Lobster Cove. We're going to be using the Waldo to Camden map of the Phillips collection to see where she ended up. So she would have ended up here on the beach on Spruce Head Island. What an amazing sight this must have been for the few residents of Sprucehead Island. Here she was, high and dry at low tide. After assessing her damage, it was found that several forward planks were broken, so the passengers were transferred to steamers Mount Desert and Catherine. Basic repairs were made, and she was able to be helped off the beach with tugboats Ralph Ross and Summers N. Smith, one of which can be seen behind her right now. She was brought to Rockland and then to Boston, where she was laid up for only 12 days. Here's a zoom in of that last photo. This eastern image really shows what the scene was like that morning. Another photo taken by Dr. Noyes of Stonington and part of the Deer Isle Stonington collection here shows passengers and spectators milling around. Dr. Noyes was most likely a passenger on the BANGOR during that time of the event. The city of Bangor continued on for another 25 years before she was tied to the Federal Wharf in East Boston and left to rot. Covered with a heavy snow in December of 1933, she sank in the harbor where her bones still lie. Now let's look at the city of Rockland. I love how these two views by Charles Townsend show her at the Eastern Steamship Wharf and give a perspective from each side of the wharf. The SS City of Rockland was a sister ship of the city of Bangor, and here she is at the Searsport Wharf. She was built by the William McKee Yard in East Boston and launched in September of 1900. She was 274 feet long, weighed 1,696 gross tons, and cost $350,000 to make. There was a grand staircase from the main saloon, 200 staterooms with 200 berths, and she could carry 2,000 passengers. She became a regular sight on the Bangor-Boston line. It was at the Kidder Point Wharf in Searsport where Stockton photographer Harriet Hitchborn made these memorable photos of passengers en route to Penobscot Park near Sears Island. While the city of Bangor led a mostly charmed life, her sister ship seemed to be cursed. She had numerous mishaps over her short career, including colliding with her sister off Portland. It was a dense fog and a strong ebb tide at the mouth of the Kennebec on September 2nd of 1923. That was the straw that broke the schooner's back. It was a hazardous area for such a large ship without fog. She went aground on Dix Island, not the same Dix Island as near Rockland. This iconic photo with a small skiff juxtaposed against a gargantuan steamer was included in our exhibit of 20 best photos. It was taken by Popham Steamboat Captain James Perkins. This image, also in Perkins' collection, looks like she is ready to take off in flight like a rocket ship. Sadly, this was not the case. Her passengers were rescued by the Popham U.S. Life-Saving Service. She stayed on the ledge for several days before being refloated and towed to Boston by the tug Summers M. Smith, name we just heard a minute ago. In Boston, she was found to be beyond repair. She stayed at the dock for a year before being towed out to Little Misery Island and burned in 1925. Our next story is a shorty but goodie. It tells the story of Bailey's mistake. And this story takes place in the 1700s, so there are no photographs to illustrate it. So we'll use the Phillips Brothers Washington County map to tell the tale. And the story goes something like this. There was a renowned sea captain, Captain Bailey, first name lost to time, who was known and revered for his exemplary seamanship and sailing skills. His ship was traveling from Boston to Lubec with a cargo of lumber. As they came up the Maine coast into the Bay of Fundy, they were passing through the reach between Grand Manan and Trescott, Maine, intending to go around West Quoddy Head into Lubec. At this time, they were socked in by a heavy fog. Old salt that he was, Captain Bailey, his ship and crew, turned too soon and turned into, at the time, this unnamed cove on the Maine coast, only to run aground high and dry. It was out of this embarrassment and pride that Captain Bailey and his crew then came ashore at this place, and there used that cargo of wood to build homes and settle at this location, never to sail again. Bailey's mistake to this day carries the history of that fateful voyage in its name. Here's one of my photos of it from a few years back with my kids racing up the beach. There was a little song that was written about that event, Captain Bailey's event. So here's to old Bailey, who sailed the salt sea till his ship ended up where it wasn't supposed to be. It goes on, but that's, I'll make you suffer through. Next, we're going to look at fishing on the Grand Banks. For centuries in New England and Canada, cod was king, and the best place to catch cod was in the Grand Banks. The methodology used for decades involved schooners and dories, and fog was a constant threat. Here we see a schooner towing out a group of dories with fishermen inside. When they reached the fishing grounds, the fishermen in singles or pairs would take to the dories where they would be set loose to fish. This photo, which is part of the Boothbay Region fishing collection, shows a schooner towing its dories, which will be unleashed at different intervals. The fishermen would use hand lines like these and fished until they filled their dories before rowing back to the mothership to empty it. Hand lines were used by literally rolling out the line with a big piece of lead and a hook down to the bottom and jigging it. And they were able to catch cod between 5 and 50 pounds, hauling them up by hand. In later times, they would set a trawl line with baited hooks like these. They also carried a foghorn. So this particular one from our collection was used on a Friendship sloop, not a Grand Banks dory. During the day, they would return several times to the mothership and unload their catches. We can see them unloading their cod in this National Fisherman photo. They're using pitchforks to pierce the cod and hoist them onto the ship. In this painting from our collection by Frederick Cozzens, It's a watercolor that was painted in 1908. We see two fishermen in a dory. One is waving a yellow flag. In the foggy background, there is a steamer. And you have to ask yourself, are they signaling to the mother ship, or are they warning one not to run over them? The Sherman's Wicker was one such Grand Bank schooner. It was restored by a friend of the museum, George McAvoy, and for years was a floating museum. Presently, you can enjoy raw oysters on her now in New York City at Hudson River Park. This photo is taken by Red Boutilier on one of the ship's trips up to Nova Scotia. In this other red photo, which shows someone on the fog watch on the Zicker off Nova Scotia, this took place in the 1980s. Dory fishing was full of perils, and scores of fishermen perished, many without a trace. Mark Kraflansky, author of Cod, a biography of the fish that changed the world, wrote that storms in the North Atlantic were responsible for a good percentage of the losses. But what dory fishermen feared most was fog, which would prevent them from finding their schooner on their return or put them at risk for being run down by another ship. So we couldn't have a talk about fog without talking about lighthouses. Here we see Forrest making his famous run up to the Marshall Point Lighthouse in the movie Forrest Gump. So we can't talk about fog without discussing lighthouses, as fog is one of the main reasons for their existence. We're going to take a look at two semi-local lighthouses in this last segment. Here we're looking at Marshall Point Lighthouse in Port Clyde. It was built in 1831 on land purchased from Samuel Marshall. It cost $2,973, and over the years had several evolutions. The bell tower was added in 1898. This is the bell tower. And this image is an Eastern Illustrating photo taken circa 1930. Looking once again at the Phillips Waldo to Camden map, we can see where Marshall Point's located and get a good understanding of why it's there. My fellow archivist Matt Wheeler and I have been working on an oral history project for several years with Marshall Point resident Gene Dalrymple, who coincidentally recently joined the Centenarian Club. Gene Dalrymple's grandfather was Captain Charles Skinner, and he was the lighthouse keeper at Marshall's Point from 1874 to 1919. Gene's mother and aunt were both born in the lighthouse keeper's cottage. Gene told us how his grandfather made leather shoes in his spare time, which coincided with the early vulcanization process for rubber. And Gene liked to quote his friend Sid Davis by saying, "The best rubber boots are made out of leather." Gene recalls in his youth of being tasked with cranking up the bell during fog and storms, a task he did not enjoy. The bell tower was crank operated and it would sound every 20 seconds. It became electrified in 1935. The second lighthouse we'll look at is that of Owl's Head. The Owl's Head Lighthouse is near Rockland, and it's a place of outstanding beauty, and its history has been replete with remarkable and even mysterious events ever since it was built following President John Quincy Adams' approval in 1824. The origin of the name Owl's Head is a mystery, whether it came from an imaginative view of a rock formation or from the English translation of the Native American word Medadukut, we'll probably never know. Owl's Head was built in 1825 for $2,707 on 17.5 acres of pine-covered headland on the south side of the entrance to Rockland Harbor. Even though the conical rubble-stone tower was quite short, only 26 feet tall, its light could be seen for 16 miles due to its elevated position. In 1869, a small fog bell was attached to the porch of the tower, and then in 1879, a fog bell operated by a Stevens striking machine was installed in a wooden pyramidal tower. The keeper needed to turn a large crank to set the clockwork mechanism in action. When visibility was low, the bell rang every 7 seconds and nearly deafened anyone nearby. In 1903, a covered way about 60 feet long was placed over the stairs, linking the oil house and the lighthouse. And 3 years later, the covering was extended 100 feet to reach the dwelling. The covered way was removed in the 1920s. There are two especially interesting fog stories associated with the supposedly haunted lighthouse. The first is a Springer Spaniel named Spot, who was owned by keeper Gus B. Hamor. Gus's daughters, Pauline and Millie, taught Spot to pull on the rope to ring the fog bell. Whenever a vessel passed nearby, Spot would ring the bell and receive the sound of a bell or horn from the ship in return. He was credited for saving the mailboat from crashing into the rocks and fog. Unfortunately, we don't have a photo of Spot. Another story tells of 2-year-old Claire, daughter of lighthouse keepers Gerald and Debbie Graham, who woke in the middle of the night to meet her Coast Guardsman father at the top of the stairs and say excitedly, "Fogs are rolling in. Time to put the foghorn on." Her surprised parents said those terms had never been used in front of her. Over the next 2 years, Claire described a man with a beard wearing a blue coat and a seaman's cap. Owl's Head light was automated in 1989. So this is the last image I'm going to share with you this evening, and it's one that I took. I'm in Belfast. I've titled this photo Ghost Ship. This is the replica HMS Bounty that was built for the movie The Bounty in 1960. And she was in Belfast in the summer of 2012 as part of a tour up the Maine coast when this foggy scene presented itself to me. A couple of months later, she met her fate, getting caught in the thick of Hurricane Sandy off the North Carolina coast and taking with her her captain and a crew member. So I hope you enjoyed all of my fog tales. I'm happy to answer any questions that I can. And I just want to say thanks for just tuning in tonight and your interest in what we do here at the museum.